Hello, everyone. Hello, and welcome to this third episode of the podcast, When the Heart Leads. I am your host, Dr. Kate Newburgh, and I am so excited to be here with you today. The title of this episode is Soul Healing. And as we'll see, I'm going to approach the idea of soul healing through the medium of language, which is as a writer, as a speaker, as someone who just works and crafts with words. Language is my medium, my ultimate medium for soul healing. And I want to begin by talking a little bit about what I mean by soul. And as I speak this, I want to just offer a framework, right? Because we all have a soul, and we all have direct contact with our soul, and we all have an understanding of what our soul is and what it means to us. So when I speak these words, it's just a framework. It's not an absolute truth. It's just maybe a way of conceptualizing it. So when I feel into the soul, it feels like that, almost that bridge dimension of self. And by that I mean the soul, which is eternal, takes many, many forms over the course of its existence. And it has this profound capacity to interact with the form, and in this case, where we stand, the human form, and also has a direct connection to the incorruptible light of self. And in this way, the soul is our closest teacher to that divine light of self. Because it understands, if you could put it in those words, it understands the human experience as well as that divine, incorruptible experience, that I am experience. And when I talk about soul healing, and we're going to go into that again through the medium of language, when I talk about soul healing, I talk about the places where our understanding of self has been, you could say, inverted. So when we have a glitch or an inversion at the level of I am, at the level of our deepest identity, that is the place where soul healing comes in. So, for example, drawing from the work, I'm very connected to the work of Dr. Claire Zammit, who talks about the transformation of identity. And many of the programs you could say programs that run at the soul level are at the level of identity. So one that many of us have, that I know I've personally worked with, is I am a burden, right? And so and you can feel the heaviness of that. And because that exists at that level of I am, the level of identity, that is the area that we work on with soul. And it's a very subtle level that underlies, influences all aspects of our life, often very subtle, often unconscious. And so my intention with this podcast episode is to begin to work with language as a medium for transforming that level of self, that level of identity, right? That aspect of self that has infinite understanding of our incorruptible purity as human beings. And so to begin with that, I am going to contrast this language of the soul, this language, you could say, of the heart, right? And we could talk about the heart as the seat of the soul, where the soul resides. And I'm pointing to the back of my heart because, as you knew in the previous episode, we worked with the sacred space of the heart through going through the back aspect of the heart. There's a an entrance there, a portal there. And so I'm touching that part because that's the throne of the soul. So we're going to contrast the language of violence and the language of oppression with this language of soul, with this language of heart. And they're very powerful. And this will offer maybe the beginning of some rational and somatic tools to begin to know the difference. Because oftentimes, again, the language of violence can be very deeply embedded. And it can surprise many of you, perhaps, what I mean by violence. And as we go through this episode, you'll understand more. So let's start with the language of violence and oppression to offer a contrast here. So this podcast began when I was listening to a talk by Dr. Marshall Rosenberg, who kind of pioneered a very simple process of the language of nonviolence. And he was talking about a Nazi officer who was on trial for war crimes. And they asked, how could you send so many of your fellow human beings to their death, to their destruction? And he said, our language made it easy. Our language made it easy. And I understood in that moment that violence, when we talk about violence, when we see violence, the physical form begins with language. That violent language is the seed of violent actions. It's the origin. You could say that violence is, in some ways, violent language is the first manifestation of violent action. And so we talk about violent language, and some of it's very obvious, very, very overt, like name calling. That's easy to recognize. You call someone a name. There's this. It's a direct hit. There's no arguing with it. It's just that's. It can be easy to recognize even as it's painful, but we can begin to move as I'm speaking of this. I do want to mention briefly, without dwelling on it, that I am speaking from deep experience with violent language, having been in a number of situations with what you could call abusive or violent language intimately. And there are levels of subtlety that I want to begin to lift up in this podcast, because violent language can also take the form of evasiveness, of subtle manipulation, of distortion. We could call gaslighting. So the denial of your own understanding and experience, the minimization of that, right? Any blame, shame, criticism, judgment, and gesture of victimhood is a language of oppression, is language of violence. And so with this, we see that physical violence is in a lot of ways simply the outward, and not simply because it's very damaging, very, very damaging, but we can see it as the outward, overt manifestation of these subtle forms of violence that begin to take root in our understanding, in our reality, through language. Right? So perhaps a physically battered woman, you could say. Someone who has been physically beaten, right? And you could take a psychologically battered woman. And what we begin to understand is that, and the psychological battering can come through denial of her experience, manipulation, gaslighting, lies, blame, shame, criticism, all of that. Her psychology looks, if you could see it, it would look like the physical battering. So what I'm trying to say here is that oftentimes the world will offer a physical representation of what's happening internally, right? And so though that woman might not show physical scars, her psychology or her psyche, down to the level even of her soul, is mirrored by the physical batterment. So it's equally detrimental, right? And so that one was kind of a hard one to explain, but having, I guess, to go over that one more time, when we see people walking around, we don't always understand the deep levels of scars and wounding that they carry. And some people we see walking around have the physical manifestation of that. And what I'm trying to say here is that that deep psychological, spiritual wounding is no less potent for being unseen, right? And it's not something that our society quite knows how to work with and heal. So that's what we're moving into here. So I want to have a quick note on victimhood, because when I talk about blame, shame, criticism, judgment, and victimhood, right? There's this. I want to really like blame, shame, criticism, judgment. Those things, they can be really easy to recognize. When we talk about victimhood, I want to lift that up for a moment with compassion, because with victimhood, we bring with victimhood an element of powerlessness, right? And that element of powerlessness is in direct contrast to our sovereign self, our divine self, the language of the heart and the soul. But that said, right, many people will stand up and state what they feel, what they've been through. That's not necessarily victimhood, right? That is, in fact, a very powerful first step to healing. It's when we begin to use that as an excuse or see it as a story of who we are that it becomes victimhood. Right? And so oftentimes this path to healing does include confronting all of that, speaking it, right? Especially speaking it to a safe place where it can be received and heard, right? And sometimes it does mean getting stuck there for a while, but ultimately the empowerment, the language of empowerment will draw you out of that experience into the true reality of who you are, which is not defined by that which has happened to you. So there is always a next move, right? There's a story, there's a confronting of the story, there's a speaking of the story, but then those who are truly looking to heal will then move past that, right? And move into a place of empowerment where that has been part of their experience but doesn't define who they truly are. It gets taken out of the I am. You could say the matrix, or the I am program that's running, right? The abuse, the trauma does not get to stick as who you are. So this, just another kind of side note on this, because I want to be really clear about this idea of victimhood, right? Because there's a lot of the blaming the victim that can happen a lot. And I want to offer it as perhaps a step toward healing. And what's become really clear to me, and as I go on in this podcast, what I think is going to be more and more illuminated, is this very precise awareness of when there is conflict and when someone doesn't actually want a resolution, right? If someone does not want a resolution in that moment within the conflict, they are still in a space of victimhood. And it is up to us to really respect that and move away. Because what happens is, if someone doesn't want a resolution, this can lead to this kind of circular dance of unending conversations which becomes a waste of time, and it's ultimately is manipulative and even parasitic to your energy. So when you know the difference, there's a part of you that knows the difference. If you're working with someone who truly wants to resolve whatever this conflict is, versus working with someone who just wants to go over and over and over again, and in that conversation they'll bring in blame, shame, criticism, right? And you'll see the victimhood at work, right? When you're in that place, it's really, really important to understand that someone needs to want a resolution to this conflict in order to be worthy of your time and attention and love. Okay, and worthy is a strong word, but as we're investigating, right, where to put the resources of our time, our compassion, our love, there are so many powerful places we can put it where it will amplify, and ultimately the language of the soul is going to be a language of amplification. Okay, so as we are working with people who want to be in that place of victimhood, we can respect that and not get caught in it. Okay, so I want to mention that as well. Very, very important for those of us, coming all the way back to those of us coming down from the mountain who are really ready to give our light in places where it will be most effective, right? We begin to develop this discernment. And there's no judgment on that person. There's just an understanding of that's where they are in their... and it might not just be a person, it might be an organization, right? It could be any... But we understand, right? We understand. We get very clear they're not interested in resolution. They're just interested in going in circles and kind of co-opting my energy, my resources. So very important discernment in this as we're talking about the language of the soul. That's one way to know. Are you speaking the language of the soul with someone, or are you being brought into a place where you're experiencing an inversion of that, right? And you're going to feel it somatically if it's amplified, if your energy is amplified, received and amplified, or if it feels like it's being sucked away, right? Very powerful indicator, no matter who they are, no matter how many credentials they have, right? That is one powerful indicator of whether you're speaking the language of the soul. So I have a side note to this side note, and I know that we're taking kind of a non-linear path through this, but each one of these side notes I feel like offers maybe a nugget, and it all orbits around this larger idea of language of the soul. So side note to the side note, when you are ready to heal. So what I've seen in my experience and with others and in my healing work with others is that severe trauma, whether it's physical or psychological or spiritual, right? What it often means is that you've been blown wide open. And sometimes that means that your boundaries have dissolved in a way. And for many of us who have experienced that, we understand that we can become completely disoriented about who we really are. The world that we had been kind of relying on, it looks different, feels different, doesn't feel as solid, right? So our boundaries can resolve, and this is a powerful time. This moment of trauma, right, can be a very powerful time for a reconfiguration, right? Because the dissolution of things that maybe weren't serving you. However, this time, because it is so disorienting, can also leave you open and vulnerable to predators, because it can be very hard as you're reorienting toward the world. And as some of your templates for cruelty and suspicion have been dissolved or blown open, it can be difficult for you to know who's truly a predator and who is speaking the language of the soul. All right, the language of ascension, you could say. And so this kind of somatic understanding can help you find solidity and give you something concrete to use as what you could call like a yardstick as you're reorienting your way in the world, right? And in this time when you might be disoriented by the trauma, blown open by the trauma. So one really very quick and concrete and practical exercise that I received from one of my teachers, Catherine Shaneberg, who works with the Kabbalistic dream imagery, and the deep subconscious, healing the deep subconscious. is one of the first things you can do if you feel as though you have experienced that trauma on whatever level, is you can place your hand over your solar plexus chakra. So this is a very concrete thing you can do, because oftentimes the rupture happens there, and your energy, it almost feels like your vital life force, your energy is pouring from that chakra. So you can place your hand, and if you see someone else has gone through trauma and you're a healer, you can put your hand over their solar plexus chakra and imagine, call in a kind of a web of light over that space. And what that does is it's almost like a powerful stop the hemorrhaging of life force. And so this web of light that forms over it, and then kind of forms over the sacral chakra. Sorry, did I say sacral chakra? I meant solar plexus chakra. Place your hands over the solar plexus chakra. Imagine a web of light there, and this forms over the rupture as a healing, kind of a second skin, almost healing it, and preserves the vital energy from kind of pouring out. So that's one of the, just as a very quick exercise, something you can do, and maybe you want to do it right now in case you do feel as though you've experienced a rupture of some sort. So thanks again to Catherine Chainberg for that visualization. So we've talked about, in this way, the language of violence, the language of oppression, right? It's any sort of blame, shame, criticism, manipulation, gaslighting, victimhood, right? So how can we begin to recognize the language of the soul? How can we begin to recognize the language of ascension, right? This is the language of the heart, right? And it's really important to know that the heart, which again, the heart, the seat, the throne of the soul which is connected to that divine light, the immortal divine light, right? The heart cannot be lied to, hoodwinked, or manipulated. It simply can't be. It is the eternally pure center of your being. The heart always knows and recognizes itself through language, through communication, right? It always knows and recognizes when it's being lied to or manipulated, when something isn't right. And I use the word squidgy sometimes, like something feels a little squidgy. It's an alert. It's an alert from my heart. Pay attention here. Something isn't quite right. The heart can be ignored. It can be suppressed, right? The voice of the heart, the alerts coming from the heart, the messages. They can be suppressed. They can be ignored. But the heart cannot be corrupted. So anyone who is perhaps lamenting, right, the loss of innocence that they feel like they've gone through, and many of us have felt that perhaps our experiences have taken away our innocence, you can let that go, because the heart cannot be corrupted no matter what happens to you. And in some ways, I see that as perhaps it's a deepening, it's a maturity beyond naivete, but it's not the loss of innocence. You can never lose that. The heart itself speaks divine truth. It is always clear, always empowering, always loving. I almost said lovering. That's cute too. Loving. And again, when I'm talking about the language of the heart, I'm talking about the soul speaking through that aspect of your being. It's the soul seated on the throne of the heart and speaking. Right? The heart being the translator of the experiences of the soul into the human realm. So the soul, the language of the soul, the language of the heart is always compassionate, And it always leaves you feeling stronger, even if it's an unpleasant truth, an unwelcome truth, right? Ultimately, it will always leave you feeling stronger, more clear. Now, that said, right, the heart, and when we call in some of these more fearsome aspects of the divine feminine, of the divine, so we know them, right? All in our own way, and many of us have experienced the more fearsome aspects of the divine feminine in our lives. We know that the heart does not coddle or support the ego. It can soothe it sometimes, it can assuage it so that we can hear truth, but it will not reinforce the ego, ever. And this is what makes the language of the heart so dangerous to those who are oriented toward violence, because the incorruptibility of the heart sees right through them. And their games, their manipulation doesn't work anymore. So with all of that said, I want to kind of turn a little bit. So we've got the language of violence, of oppression, right? We've got how it's threatened by the heart, because the heart is incorruptible and eternally innocent. The heart is the seat of the throne of the soul, which is eternally connected to our incorruptible divine light, right? And I want to talk a little bit about how this moves into the world, right? So we have the background of it, right? We know in some ways, like this kind of crash course on the language of violence, or the language of oppression, which will include blame, shame, criticism, lies, manipulation, victimhood, all of that, right? The denial of your true experience. We have that. And then we have in contrast to the language of the heart, the soul, which is always empowering, always creates clarity, right? Brings you what you need in that moment so that you orient again and again and again to your sovereign self, your empowered self, your divine self, the one that is untouched, uncorrupted. And I want to talk now about this idea of the meek, M-E-E-K, meek, right? I'm going to take a sip of water real quick. So there is this statement by one of the most heart-centered humans who's ever walked the earth, and I speak of Jesus Christ. Again, this is not a religious podcast, but draws from many different wisdom traditions and many different teachers of the heart. So we have heard that the meek shall inherit the earth. And I want to talk a little bit about what that means. What does it mean to be meek? Because there's a deep truth there about the language of the heart, and how the language of the heart can be embodied in the world. Right? And many of us, when we think about meek, we think about being a doormat, kind of being passively allowing the world to just have its way with us, right? And we can think, well, is that the language of the heart, to just be a doormat, to just let anyone kind of do whatever they want, and we just, we'll just sit back and twiddle our thumbs and wait patiently and maybe passive aggressively for everything to clear over? And the answer is no. No, I want to bring a different idea of what it means to be meek into this conversation, because this idea of meekness is actually the language of the heart, but it means something different from what we might have come to think of it to mean. So I do want to bring us to the phrase. I was really confused about that and really resistant to it until I heard the phrase meek as Moses. And maybe some of you have heard that phrase, maybe you haven't. It was new to me when I heard it. And I just want to mention quickly that this is the second time Moses has walked into our conversations in 3 episodes. So he feels like kind of an overlighting presence or an overlighting guide in this moment. But meek is Moses, right? So let's talk about Moses for a second, right? Moses was a complete badass. If we look at him in history, like he's sitting there confronting the Pharaoh, right? Which is by the divine right of kings, like essentially an embodied figure of God in Egypt, right? The representation of God in human form. And we can talk more about that because in my first book, I talk about how all humans are actually the embodied form of God. But let's talk about right now, like where the context of Moses, he's sitting there confronting the Pharaoh, right? And who is he to do that? You know, is he some high nobleman? Is he some advisor? No, he's a representative of the slave class. He's confronting Pharaoh. He's commanding plagues. He's parting the Red Sea. He wanders. He takes his people out into the unknown, the desert. He wanders for 40 years, receiving direct messages from God. Right? Chastising his people for going off course. Right? This Moses is a firebrand. He's a revolutionary. He's a powerful man. Right? And so how can we call this man meek? Meek as Moses. Right? And in that is what I want to lift up as a perhaps under recognized language of the heart, of the soul. So Moses was surrendered. But he wasn't surrendered to the ego. He wasn't surrendered to the oppressive programs of the earth that had taken over the earth. He was surrendered to the highest light. He was surrendered to the divine, the voice, the will. He was irradiated with the light and the will of God. And we could talk about God in many different ways, but that pure, incorruptible light of creation, of goodness, of love. And I'm going to have another diversion here, because in my first book, which by the way is called The New Eden, Paradise Retold, that's my first book. I talk about this archetype of the slave. And in many ways, as I'm talking about this, I realize that Moses is the perfect representation of the archetype of the slave in its highest form, because the slave is a very, very powerful archetype. But every archetype has a shadow and a light side, right? And in the shadow, the slave is completely co-opted in service to destructive forces. In its light, the slave is completely surrendered to the heart, completely surrendered in service to divine light. And in this way, because we become what we surrender to, right? That's a whole other podcast episode maybe. But just to mention it here, because we become what we surrender to. When you embrace that archetype of the slave and orient toward the highest divine light, then in that way the slave, which is considered the lowest aspect of humanity, becomes God. That's how the slave becomes God, by surrendering to that highest light. And this is what Moses did. He became irradiated with the light and the will of God. Right? And when we look at how that bodied forth, how that was embodied in him, what we see is a very powerful voice, a revolutionary voice. Right? And this is a language of the heart that I really want to lift up, because this is a language of the heart that we often forget. Right? When we say meek as Moses, we're not saying, okay, cool, whatever you want. right? We'll just stay slaves because that's what divine will says. It's sometimes the most powerful message that can come through the heart is the word no. No. Absolutely not. So I'm going to talk in a little bit about how this is very different from resistance, right? And this is a fine, fine line for us to understand, and one that, I'm constantly refining in my life. But I want to talk for a moment about these misconceptions of unconditional love. I'm going to take one more sip of water here. We're on a roll, aren't we? So this brings us into the idea of the misconceptions that exist, especially, I would say, in a lot of, I'm not going to say especially spiritual circles, because I'm going to say in especially everywhere, right? Misconceptions of unconditional love. And again, this is something I talk in more depth about in my first book, The New Eden, Paradise Retold. But I want to lift up some of the main points here. So for a long time, in many of my interactions and even intimate relationships, and my workplace, like you can name this anywhere in the world, right? Anywhere you go in the world. I thought that unconditional love meant that you could let someone do whatever they want to you and never say a word against them. I thought unconditional love meant you were never angry, you were very submissive, you always just let it go. I thought that's what surrender was, right? And this understanding of unconditional love that was just like, do whatever you want to me and I'll just love you anyway, right? This worked really well for the abusers I was with. And it works really well for the systems of oppression that we live within. And as we talk more and more about the subtleties of language and how language is the root of physical violence, right? We're going to start to see that more and more and more in the systems that we live within. But don't worry, it doesn't stop there, because the language of the heart brings you to transcend all of that. This is a podcast episode, you guys. We are getting into it. So, but this idea that unconditional love means do whatever you want to me and I'll love you anyway and forgive you, right? That works really well for systems of oppression, for people who perpetrate oppression. And it's important to know, and I'm drawing right now from some of the work of, there's a book called Why Does He Do That? Inside the Minds of Angry and Controlling Men. And this book, and the author will come to me for this book, somehow escaping me right now. It'll come back. But that's the name of the book. This person is a man who ran abuse circles for men who were abusers, specifically men who were abusers. And one thing he found was that most abusers, the statistics say that if you're oriented that way, you're not going to change. And this is a tough one. It's not our job to change them. And when we extrapolate that, we're going to see that it's not our job to change the systems of oppression that are in place, because the more we interact with them, the more power they receive. Right? And I understand that this is maybe a radical idea, so I'm going to go more into this, but it's fine. All right? You are that way. The systems in place are that way. We do not need to change them in order to be free. If we think that, then we're bound by them. Right? So how then does unconditional love, does the language of the soul and heart lead us into freedom, even as parts of us exist within these systems of oppression, right? So it's important to know that the freedom of the heart, the freedom of the soul is, you could call it the ultimate overrider, right? It overrides everything because it exists in that first light. Before all this other stuff came into being, the light of the heart, the light of the soul existed in that divine perfection, in that incorruptibility, right? It's kind of the ace card. You pull it and everything else doesn't matter. And we'll talk about how that works and weaves its way through these systems, within the systems. beyond the systems that we live within, right? It lives beyond any language or system of oppression. So when we talk about unconditional love, right, where do we begin with this movement into freedom, right? How do we begin to use our language to free us from these bindings that exist sometimes very deeply at the level of identity, at the soul level? How do we begin to unpick that and free ourselves from that? Awake, aware people, and those of us truly awakening to our incorruptible divine nature, our first gesture is to turn all of the care, all of the love, all of the nurturing that we are capable of giving, to turn it toward the self. Turn it toward the self first. And this is truly a breathtaking freedom. Because as we begin to define our own contours, and in some ways not even define our own contours, but feel into what our divine contours are beyond what's been defined for us by the people, the conditioning, the family structures we're in, and then going out and out and out, extrapolating the economic structures we're in, right? As we begin to move past all of that, led by the language of the heart, led by this continual, constant surrendering to the highest incorruptible divine light within us, which our heart will lead us in stages through and through and through, we break into, over and over again, greater and greater expanses of freedom, breathtaking levels of freedom. We begin to understand that we are absolutely unbound, completely unbound from all expectations and demands. We don't have to do anything. And I know that this could short circuit a little bit, like all of the things that we've been told. And it's, again, this dawns on us in degrees, right? It dawns on us in degrees. The first step might be something that seems really small, but it's actually a huge movement, a huge karmic clearing. So really, I want to share a story that, again, Dr. Marshall Rosenberg shared when he was talking about this. And he said there was someone in his workshop who pushed back on this and said, sometimes there are just things that we have to do and we have to do them. And he said, well, what's one thing you have to do? And she said, I have to cook for my family. And I hate cooking for my family, but I have to do it. And over the course of working with him, through kind of working with the language of the heart, and I know we'll come back to more about what that means, she went home and tried it out, and she experimented, and she said, okay, I'm not cooking tonight or ever again because I hate doing it. And the actual impact on her family was an opening, a lightness, a release, because her frustration and resentment was palpable. You could almost say that, like, then consumed, right? It's like in the food that people are eating, consumed, brought into the body, right? There's all these different layers of it. And so when she just said, I'm not doing it anymore, and then her family was able to shift, change, and adjust so that people still got fed, right? But she wasn't this kind of thundercloud of resentment. Like, suddenly things opened up, and she realized, like, there's this whole level of freedom, because that thing is not nourishing to me. It's not something I can give. It's not something I can give. And again, coming back to this idea of unconditional love, right? When we turn that first toward the self, we begin to really tune into what is it that we can give deeply, joyfully. What is it that we can give that amplifies us, and what is it that we can't? And we begin to experiment. And that word no, which is sometimes the most powerful divine word in the English language, no thank you, no. Essentially the word that Moses stood within, right? And he stood at a huge level of no, which was essentially releasing his entire, all his brethren, his race of people from slavery. But we can do that at what looks like maybe a smaller, more personal scale in our lives. Begin there, right? And then branch out. When we begin to practice that, we begin to really tune into what we can give that amplifies our light, right? And as we begin to do that and tune toward that, move toward that, orient toward that, then the language of the heart, the language of the soul, is present in our empowerment, in our giving, in our freedom to say yes and to say no, to live beyond the expectations of other people, to live beyond the expectations that have been placed on us, and eventually to begin to dismantle those identities of self that are bound to systems, language, violence, of oppression, to language, the systems of violence and oppression, the ones that would deny our incorruptible divine light. And what I'm talking about, so there's this little phrase that just to kind of bring it into a maybe like a pithy thing that you can take home with you. Is I heard this phrase that was something like, we don't always get what we want or what we think we want, right? But we do get what we tolerate. And what I'm talking about here is leveraging language into a realization of radical self-worth. So this isn't rebellious. This isn't resistant. Again, if you've ever tried to have a conversation with someone who is deeply embedded in the language of violence or oppression, then you know that the more you speak with them, the more you try to convince them, the more you try to change them, the more you interact with them at all, the more your energy gets sucked away from you, right? So if you resist, if you rebel, if you try to explain yourself, right, all of that is just feeding energy into that person, or you could say even that system, right? So this isn't rebellion. This isn't resistance. And now that's a fine line to talk about, because what you could say that when Moses stood up to the Pharaoh and he used his divine light to say no, right? You could interpret that as resistance. You could interpret that as rebellion. But it was actually something much more powerful, because it was a calm, firm, unflinching divine no that came from a place far beyond, transcendent of these systems of oppression. So it did not engage with that. It cut through it. It dissolved it. It broke those barriers. It just said, no. Not no, and let's talk about it. Not, can we find a compromise or somewhere? It's just, no. This will not stand. And that's a divine truth. And the more you resist that divine truth, the more you will feel the consequences of it. Because the divine truth is that all people are free. And I'm speaking within that divine truth, not in resistance to what you believe, but simply in that realm of truth, all people are free. This system does not uphold that truth. Therefore, this system is ultimately fragile. And it takes that language, that beginning of language, as we embody this freedom, we begin to feel it through our language, where we say yes, where we say no, where we choose to give, where we choose not to give. So it's true that as you begin to embody this, and as you begin to, maybe you take small steps in your life. No, I can't commit to that. Or I did commit to that, but I'm understanding that it's not what I'm meant to commit to, right? And I'm going to talk more about this idea of integrity, right? In fact, I'm going to talk about it right now. So real quick, as we do this, right, as we begin to look at what's truly resonant, what's not resonant, right? Again, and this is, again, a section in my first book, The New Eden, Paradise Retold, but we talk about integrity, and there's this idea that integrity is you do what you say you're going to do, right? And that's what I call reliability. And reliability is important, right? It's important, but even more important is integrity, which is in alignment with the deeper giving of your soul, of your heart. Eventually, they become very close together, reliability and integrity, because you're so attuned to what you can and cannot give, to what is true for you to give and right for you to give and what isn't, right? But maybe you agree to things and there's that squidginess, right? There's that, I don't know about that. Maybe you've agreed anyway because you feel like you should, because you feel like it would be good for someone or whatever, but it's not aligned with your soul. It's actually out of integrity to go through with that thing. It's actually out of integrity for that woman to cook for her family when she feels like it's an imposition. Ultimately, anything you do from that place is going to cause more harm than good, no matter how good your intentions were in agreeing. All right, so the difference here between integrity and reliability, and I understand there's a lot in this podcast. You might have to listen a few times. I've spent a lot of time thinking about these things, so it's all kind of coming out at once. But when we're talking about that deeper level of integrity, which might mean going back and saying, actually, that thing I agreed to, that's not actually in deeper alignment with my soul. You don't have to put it that way, right? You could just say, actually, I can't do it, right? I won't do it. I won't do it anymore. This is not something I can agree to. This is not something I can follow through with, right? And while it seems unreliable, well, you might almost begin to feel flaky. What's actually happening is that you're coming into alignment with a much deeper truth. And that is the heart of integrity. So other people may not like it when you begin to use this language of the heart and soul, this empowering language, this language of inherent, incorruptible self-worth, this language of unconditional self-love, this deep listening to what's truly nourishing and life-giving to you. Right? When you begin to do that, when you begin to live in that way, other people might not like it because you're changing the rules on them. And we see when people begin to get strong in abusive or oppressive situations, the abuser or the oppressor resists, puts on more pressure. Right? And that's another way you can know who and what you're dealing with, because when you're truly in alignment with what's good for you and people around you cannot accept that, you're seeing that they have an agenda that has nothing to do with your own well-being. You can see that. It's a very easy test. How do people react to your no? Right? So other people might not like it. You need to be prepared for that. When we begin to live within the language of the heart, the language of the soul, what is truly unconditional self-love, the words, the gestures, the actions, the way of being that is in complete alignment with unconditional self-worth and self-love, that is in constant contact with that incorruptible, uncorrupted divine light. And that begins to come through us as beings on earth, right? That is ultimately the way of being that will dismantle these systems of oppression. But we have to be ready for the backlash that's going to come and stand firm in our no, stand firm in our yes, stand firm in whatever is deeply true, right? Whatever is surrendered to that higher divine light of our knowing. We will be led through it. We will. Our heart will lead us through it unscathed. But it becomes very clear when you begin to stop living by the expectations of others, by the agendas and manipulations, even unconscious, even when they're unconscious, even when they're meant well, we stop living by those expectations. We begin to step further and further into our unbound, free nature. We begin to see very quickly who and what is walking with us and who and what has an agenda beyond our own well-being. So the language of the heart is one that amplifies, that lifts up, that reinforces our inherent freedom and our inherent worthiness, no matter what. This worthiness, this beauty, this freedom, it cannot be taken away, no matter what. It can be obscured, it can be denied, but it can never be taken away from us. And the language of the heart will always bring us back to that. Sometimes the language of the heart, the language of the soul, is kind and gentle and soothing. Sometimes it's firm and strident. It is always aligned with our deepest heart. If we think about the lightning rod, and again, this is my image of integrity when I talk about integrity, especially in, again, I wrote about in the New Eden Paradise Retold, but when we think about the lightning rod, it's not very big. You don't have to be big. But it is perfectly aligned. The structural integrity of a lightning rod, and maybe it's even kind of thin, right? It's not very big, but it's perfectly aligned. And in that perfect alignment, it commands the energy of the cosmos. It brings the energy of the lightning itself through and into the earth. And if it's even one particle is out of alignment, it'll shatter. Right? So as we begin to get aligned through what we say yes to, through what we say no to, through where we stand firm, right? As we step more and more into alignment, we begin to command greater and greater and greater aspects of energy through us into the world. You don't have to be big. Just need to be aligned, right? So to come back a little bit to this, where do we begin, right? You can begin to tell when language is coming from somewhere other than the heart. And that includes when you're saying it, or when you're receiving it from others. There's this kind of, your heart will let you know, there's this little, I call it squidgy. Like sometimes there's just a squidgy feeling like, that's just not quite right. Something about that doesn't feel right. I'm not sure about that. I need to sit with that. I need to investigate that, or I need to let that go. And, it can be kind of a little squidginess, or it can be a really big, like, no, this language is violent, is oppressive. This is denying my experience. This is denying my inherent worth. This is denying my humanity. Right? This is denying my This is denying my inherent freedom to choose what is and is not good for me. Right? We begin the heart, because the heart exists in that place of incorruptibility. It will always let you know, always. It is a consistent, incorruptible barometer of truth. And what's interesting is that there is the language, and then there is, when we're talking about the lightning rod, there is the alignment of the person who is speaking the language. So the heart can kind of suss it out on every level, right? Because have you ever had two people say the same thing, but from one person it sounded kind of trite, or you got that squidgy feeling? It's the same words maybe. From one person it sounded kind of trite, but from another it changed your life. It was transformative. That's because that's the lightning rod alignment, right? That delivers the words directly to another. It's a transmission. And so the heart, when we talk about these subtle layers of soul, these subtle layers, these energetic layers that exist beneath the words. I want to say, because someone will be like, I never said that, right? But you did say that with your energy, with your frequency, with your transmission. The heart picks up on all of that, is the most subtle barometer of truth, right? And you can listen. Someone might be saying all the right things to you, but there's something about it that doesn't feel right. That's your heart saying, this person is not in alignment. This is not lightning rod alignment. This is manipulation. There's something going on here. So the full-bodied transmission, right? You can tune into the full-bodied transmission. And when somebody is in full alignment, the deep alignment of their being, of your being, when you're in full alignment with your words, when they're in full alignment with their words, you feel it. It's a fully embodied transmission of deep truth. And that is ultimately what we're going for. Words, being, beliefs, body, frequency, all in alignment. Right? It never coerces. It never manipulates. The voice of the heart, the voice of the soul, the language of the soul, it beckons you. It beckons you through joy, through possibility, through freedom, through expansiveness, right? It touches that part of you that is eternally light and free. So soul healing, coming all the way back. We've been through a lot in this episode. But this soul healing ultimately centers on, can come through, can be realized through the language, the full-bodied transmission of language that is fully aligned with our incorruptible divine light. Through where we can say yes and where we can say no. Through unconditional self-love that will body forth in whatever way is necessary, is completely responsive to any circumstance, any person, and will come out in the way that is most responsive, most adaptive to whatever the circumstance is. And you can trust it, sometimes soft, strident, joyful, beckoning, right? Sometimes firm, unflinching. Never resistant, never rebelliant, just centered in that place of truth. The language that comes from there is the language that dismantles all violence and oppression. So to bring this all back to something you can practice is this week, today, as you move forward, see where you can perhaps begin to say yes, to say no, in ways that are fully, perfectly aligned with you. And as you do that, through every simple heart-centered yes, every simple heart-centered no, you will be led into greater and greater alignment. Over time, you will begin to command greater and greater forces, power. To the point where your entire life will become an embodiment of freedom. The kind of breathtaking freedom that exists beyond the boundaries of our rational thought. The freedom of the archetype of the slave as it surrenders again and again and again to the highest voice, the highest light of the heart and soul, the highest divine light. We cannot know what that looks and feels like. It's step by step by step. This heart-centered yes, this heart-centered no. And as you take each step, you will begin to be led out, transcending out of any system that would control you or put limits on your own divine light. Step by step by step. Soul healing. Soul healing. Yes, a simple yes, a simple no from the heart. Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of When the Heart Leads. I am your host, Dr. Kate Newburgh. I'm so grateful to be connecting with you across time and space. From my heart to yours. Till next time.